the focus is really to talk about ways to improve our memories, but I want to start with talking a little bit about the brain so we understand how the process works. And so probably, as you all know, the brain is the organ in your body that controls all the other parts of your body. And most people think about the signals the brain sends to muscles of our body so we can move. So this is our motor control. We also have our autonomic nervous system. I like to call it our automatic nervous system because these nerves actually control internal organs like your heart and your lungs to work without you having to think about it, which is a good thing because you wouldn't have to want to think about taking a breath every minute. So we have nerves in our nervous system that are able to do that for us. We also have nerves that go up to the brain so that we know what it is that we're sensing. So things like our sense of vision, hearing, touch, that's all related through a neural network to the brain for processing. And here's something a lot of people don't think about. Our nerves work with our immune system to allow our immune system to respond to an infection and help fight off some sort of infection. We have nerves, brain cells are called neurons, and neurons are connected together to communicate. And so we do have groups of neurons that work together to control our moods and our emotions and our behaviors. And what we're going to talk today is about the neural circuits, the brain cells that are involved in helping us learn information, but also retaining that information, which is our memory system. And then finally, even though a lot of our neural pathways are the same in all of us, we do have neural pathways that are unique in each one of us. And that's what makes us all different and unique beings. So it's the brain is a very interesting structure, and there's a lot that we still have to learn about it. So us neuroscientists are always excited about learning more things about the brain. I want to start out with just a picture of the human body. In red is your brain, and the long red line is your spinal cord, and that makes up the central nervous system. And it is attached to the blue lines, which are the peripheral nervous system. So our brain can send a signal out to the muscles of our body by using the red system into the blue system to move muscles. But we can also send sensory information the opposite way. So using the blue colored area first going up to the red. So that's if you want to know what it is you're touching or seeing. So the systems are connected to relay information from brain to body or body to brain. My first image is of a brain, and I don't know if you can still see me. I've got a nice skull here to show you. So our brain is really soft and squishy, like Jell-O. So it's good that we keep it in this nice bony case so that it can be protected. So very squishy substance, but encased with a hard bony substance that keeps it safe. And I wanted to talk about that brain cells are called neurons. And these are two cartoon drawings of what a brain cell looks like. And brain cells send information through chains or pathways to each other to communicate. And so if the neuron on the top here that we see receives information, it will make electricity, which is the green line that just showed up. And when that electricity hits the very bottom of the neuron, it allows that neuron to release these little red dots, which are called neurotransmitters. And if you notice, the two neurons actually don't touch. And that little space is called a synaptic cleft. So those little red dots have to be able to float through the space and try to stick onto the neuron number 2 in our picture here. And when that happens, when the red dots, the neurotransmitters, stick on to neuron number 2, it'll allow the second neuron to make that green line, which is a action potential or electrical energy. And then it can release its own neurotransmitters. So this whole tedious process that I just described actually happens really quickly. And neurons can send signals up to 220 miles an hour. So as fast as a race car, our neurons can operate, which is very helpful. Also, our nervous system, we're born with 200 billion neurons. But by the time we're an adult, we have 100 billion neurons. And that's because if neurons don't make connections with other neurons, they will die. So as a baby is born, these neurons start to form chains and pathways so that we can grow and develop. So we're born with more than what we need, so that by the time we're an adult, the ones that have made communities and connections survive, the ones that haven't will die off. I want to show you a picture of blood supply to the brain. So all these red lines are blood vessels, and our blood supply brings oxygen and nutrients to all the cells of our body. Our brain cells are always working. Even when we're sleeping, they're working. So it's good that we have a lot of blood going to our brain to bring oxygen and nutrients to our neurons. A question I always get is, what color is the human brain? And like on my brain t-shirt, we've colored it pink. The reason it looks pink is because of all the blood vessels. But if we could strip away the blood vessels, your brain actually looks gray in color. And you might have heard gray matter before. That's the true color of a brain. This is actually a real photograph of a real human brain, and it's the left lateral side view of the brain. And you're probably saying that right away, hey, Barb, this isn't gray in color, and that's true. When we remove brains from our cadavers, the brains are all fixed and fixative or a chemical. And so it makes the brains so they're not squishy anymore, so we can hold them in our hands. But it also changes the color from gray to this kind of light brown color that you see here. One thing you'll notice about the brain is trying to tell the front from the back. And I'm actually going to draw over here. I always tell the students to, if you can see that this part of the brain is called the cerebrum, and it looks like a giant mitten. And I'm going to draw the mitten out for you in red. So here's the thumb part. There's a little delay in the drawing. There it is. So it kind of looks like a mitten or a boxer's boxing glove. If you slide your hand from the back to the front to put into this mitten or boxer's glove, you can tell which way is the front part of the brain, and front is the word rostral, and the back part of the brain is caudal. So that's one way you can tell which way is the front and which way is the back in this picture. The other thing you might notice is that there's a bunch of squiggles on the brain, and each one of those squiggles is called a gyrus. And they actually all have individual names that students have to learn if they take a class with me. But we're not going to go into that today. But inside the gyrus is, if we looked under a microscope, would be all those lovely neurons. And there'd be 100 billion of them in the brain. So that's what you'd find inside the gyrus. The space between the squiggles is just a space, but in neuroscience, we call that a sulcus. I also want to show a picture of the brain from almost the top view. And what I'm trying to depict here is that the brain can be divided into a right and a left brain hemisphere. And there are differences between the right and left brain sides. The example I'm going to use is with speech. So most of our speech centers for most people are in their left brain hemisphere. So you have neurons that find the word you want to say, and they send them forward to another group of neurons that are going to control the muscles in your larynx and pharynx so you can actually say the word. So speech is a left brain hemisphere, but the neurons on the right are also involved in communication, but they're reading body language and facial expression. So you can tell a lot by the way somebody holds their body or the look on their face, and that's a way to communicate. Also, the right side of your brain interprets the musicality of speech, which we call prosody of speech. And the way we emphasize words can have a totally different meaning. And it's your right brain hemisphere that can decide that. So if I say the sentence, the cat went outside, and I'm going to say it again, but with a different emphasis, the cat went outside. You get it's the same words, but emphasized different. You can tell that the second time I was pretty upset that the cat went outside because maybe it's an indoor cat. But the first time it sounded like a statement like, oh yeah, my cat, went outside. It doesn't always have to stay inside. So the way you intonate words is interpreted on your right brain hemisphere. So there are differences between the right and left side. This is back to that side view of the brain, and I've divided the brain into 4 big areas called brain lobes, and we're going to go over really quickly the function. So different parts of the brain, the neurons have different functions. And so if we start with the one that's colored in green, and if you touched your hand on your forehead, you would be touching your frontal lobe. And the neurons here are in pathways that are going to control movement of your body. So your left frontal lobe is actually going to connect to the right side of your body. So the pathway is going to cross over. So if you've ever known anybody that had left frontal lobe damage, they may not be able to move the right side of their body. There's also neurons here that are involved in decision-making, controlling your personality and your moods. And these neurons, especially the decision-making neurons, don't really get mature or make their connections really finalized until people are in their early to mid-20s, which makes sense why children and teenagers sometimes don't make good decisions. These connections haven't fully developed yet. The next brain lobe in yellow, and that'd be the one on the top of your head, is called the parietal lobe. It is receiving sense of touch. So all the little nerves in your fingertips are going to relay up here to this lobe of the brain. And we could all reach our hand in a bag with coins in it, and without using our eyes, just with sense of touch, be able to pull out the penny compared to the quarter. And that's because our nerves are sending the signal to the brain, and the brain knows the difference between those 2 coins. In red, in the very back of your brain, so if you put your hands right on the back of your head, you'd be in the occipital lobe. This lobe is totally devoted to visual processing. So even though your eyes are in the front of your head, the neurons are going to make a pathway all the way back here so you know what it is that you're seeing. And then finally, we're going to talk a lot about the temporal lobe. If you can find the temples on your face, if you could go deep from those temporals on your face into your brain, you'd be in the temporal lobe. And it makes sense, since our ears are nearby, that hearing is going into this brain area. But also really deep in this brain lobe is a structure called the hippocampus. And it's shaped like a seahorse, and hippocampus is the genus name for seahorse. So the seahorse-shaped structure in the temporal lobe is full of neurons that are able to help us learn information and keep it as a memory. And we're going to talk more about that here in just a minute. I wanted to also show you, we can cut a brain right down the middle in half, and we still see our brain lobes, but now we see some other brain structures. And I always tell students to look for the hummingbird. So let me outline the hummingbird for you. And we'll see that our hummingbird has a head and a beak. You can see my red outline. So it kind of outlines, we see a bird's head, a bird's beak as the hypothalamus, the bird's body as brainstem, and the wings as the cerebellum. Now, the brainstem part of the brain are where the neurons are located that are going to go down to control our heart and lungs. So connected with all those internal organs. We don't consciously think about that. These neurons work without us having to ask ourselves to breathe or digest our breakfast. And then the cerebellum, it looks like a giant snowflake. Cerebellum is a Latin word that means little brain. And so early anatomists thought the cerebrum, where the brain lobes are, was the big brain, and this little guy sat underneath. The cerebellum has neurons in it that are going to help you with motor learning. So if you're learning how to dribble a basketball or a new dance step, the neurons here are going to make the connection so that we can learn that kind of activity. So different than our temporal lobe, the hippocampus, that is learning and memory as well, but more for dates and facts, how to do a math problem. So 2 different areas of the brain that help with us learning different types of information. All right. I want to show you that we don't cut people open and take their brains out to see what their problems are, but we can image people. And this is an MRI. CT does the same thing. It's a way to take a picture without cutting people open, so it totally doesn't hurt. And we can see the brain, and this is a brain cut right down the middle, or a picture taken right in the middle of the brain. And if you have a keen eye, you can see that hummingbird again. So I'll try to trace it out for you, just like in the real brain picture that we showed. The outline of the hummingbird shows up once again. So a way to look at neuroanatomy without cutting open somebody's brain. All right, so now that we've learned a little bit about the brain and how it works, I wanted to talk specifically about how does learning and memory work. And that takes us back to our lovely brain cells, the neuron. And so as we talked about earlier, neurons will communicate with each other through pathways and chains, and they send that electrical energy that showed up as green, release the red dots, which are neurotransmitters, through the synaptic cleft, and that will stick onto the second neuron, which will make its electricity and release neurotransmitters. The little bit of extra detail is how do these neurotransmitters stick on to the second neuron? And that little structure is called a dendrite, and I've colored some of them in pink for you. So they almost look like tree branches coming off neurons, and our neurotransmitters are going to try to stick onto those. But in addition to the dendrites can grow these little spines. They just showed up as yellow triangles. And these are called dendritic spines. And so as we learn information, we will grow out these dendritic spines so it's easier to catch neurotransmitters and make a strong connection between neurons. And so we do this process every time we're trying to learn something. We will try to grow out these dendritic spines on our neurons. And this process is called plasticity. And the first time I heard the word plasticity, I was thinking of something plastic, like a Rubbermaid container. But in neuroscience, it means the ability of neurons to make these little yellow triangles, these dendritic spines, so we can keep information that's really important to us so we can use it later. So knowing how this neuroscience process works, how do we get our neurons to make and create these dendritic spines? And so with my students, I really encourage what's called a multimodal learning approach, which means we want to activate many different neurons in our brain. The more neurons we turn on, the more the brain sees that information as important, and we need to keep it. If someone gave you the passcode, a quick passcode to get into your bank account, it's always a temporary one. You type in those numbers, you don't want to remember it again because it's just easy access into your bank account. You won't grow a spine, but something that you use over and over again, your neurons are going to want to make dendritic spines and keep that information. If we don't use information, those spines will actually involute and go away. So the example I like to give is at one point in time when I was in high school, I took algebra and I was pretty good at it. So I grew spines on my neurons to remember the algebra. But now it's been over 30 years since I've done an algebra problem. So those spines, because I haven't used it, have gone back in. And so if I try to do an algebra problem right now, it might be pretty hard for me because I haven't done it in so many years. The spines have gone back in. So if we want information to stay, we have to keep those spines out and we have to use the information. So I always tell students when you're learning something new to draw it, touch it, move your body. And this is using motor skills, the cerebellum, which we know can learn information, and visual skills. So the little picture diagram I'm showing here is a student drew out their digestive system. So the drawing, the motor drawing is helping you remember it better than if you just stared at a picture in a book of your stomach. And that really helps get that information into your memory. And so always remember that images are always easier to remember than paragraphs of words. So I always tell my students to draw something out as a graph or a picture so you can remember it better. And when you get to a test, you can pull up an image in your mind, but it's really hard to pull up paragraphs of words. So anything you can turn into an image, you'll learn it better. Another thing to do is say the concepts out loud. So that's using those speech neurons because you have to find the word and say the word. It's really good to teach a friend. If you don't have a friend, I always say line up your stuffed animals and teach that new concept, or get out your pet turtle and teach to them. So really interesting when you say something in your mind, it's really different than having to say it out loud. And I always suggest to my students that I'd rather them study 20 minutes a day, every day of the week, than one time a week for 2 hours. And this goes back to how our neurons work. So if we are turning on those neurons every day, the brain is like, oh my gosh, they're accessing this information every day. We might better keep this into a memory. But if you come to class and it's been 6 days until you've looked at the information again, your brain's like, oh, it must not be that important because he or she hasn't used that in 6 days. So a little bit each day will make your brain think this is an important concept. I need to keep it. I also tell students to recap what they've learned right away after they've learned it. And so take 15 minutes, meet with a friend and go, here's the highlights of what I've learned today. And I realize some of you might not be actively taking a class right now. So how as adults do we learn or use this information I just gave you? I'll use the example of it when you meet somebody. So if you meet somebody named Bob, it's good to say that person's name back to them again. So say, hey, Bob, it's really nice to meet you. So you've used that auditory skill. Shake their hands is a motor learning skill. The other thing that we do is if we already know someone named Bob, we have a memory of Bob in our brain. So if we're like, oh, my brother's name is Bob, nice to meet you, you can put your new friend Bob in on the memory neuron of your brother Bob that's already established in your brain. And if you noticed, that was the little trick I did with you all to find the hummingbird in our brain. So when I showed you the brain, it was like, oh my gosh, there's all these things. I don't know what they are. But the minute I show somebody find the hummingbird, everybody has a memory of what a hummingbird looks like already in their memory system. So I just tie that new brain information in with your memory of the hummingbird. Or when I gave the example of the brain kind of looks like a mitten or a boxer's boxing glove, everyone already knows what that looks like. And so it's easy to put the side view of the brain in with a mitten or boxer's glove. So if you can tie new information with something that's already old and established, it'll go into your memory system quicker. I wanted to talk about sleep. Sleep is very important for brain functioning. I know I'm showing you a graph here, and sometimes people are like, oh no, a graph, but we're going to do this very simply. So on the x-axis, which is the one going horizontal, there's numbers 0 through 8. That's the number of hours that you're sleeping. And then on the vertical axis or the y-axis, this is your brainwave activity. So we can do an experiment called an EEG, electroencephalogram, where they put all these electrodes on your head, and then they measure your brainwave activity. And of course, at the top, you'll see awake. That's a brain with a lot of high brainwave activity. And down at stage 4, the brainwaves are really slow because you're in very deep sleep. And so my yellow box is showing the first couple hours of sleep, which is deep sleep. That's the time where you're resting your body. So you're getting all your muscles and bones and ligaments back rested up from all the activity you did during the day. You'll notice on the graph that after we do a session of deep sleep, we go into something called REM sleep. And if you look where REM is, it's up where your brain looks very active on a brainwave EEG meter. REM stands for rapid eye movement. So when you watch somebody who's sleeping, their body is still, but their eyes are moving rapidly back and forth under their eyelids. So it's a very active, almost awake brain during our REM sleep cycle. And REM is the time that your brain is transferring what you learned into a memory, right? So that's what's happening during REM cycle. You'll notice after the first REM, you're going to go back into a deep sleep. That's the second yellow box. And then you'll have another REM cycle. And then you don't go back into a real deep sleep, but you do have one more little period of resting the body. And then the rest of your night of sleep, you're just going in and out of REM cycles. So after hours 5 and up, you're just doing REM. So the key here is if you only get 4 hours of sleep at night, your body is rested for the next day, but you haven't had enough REM sleep to put information into a memory. So you're really needing to get those more hours of sleep. And there was just an article that came out that said that adults need 7 to 8 hours of sleep for optimal cognitive performance. And this graph would actually substantiate that. We also know that sleep is a time, and this is a weird thing, there's water in our brain called cerebrospinal fluid, and we don't know why, but at night, that's when it makes this huge flush or sweep that's called the CSF sweep. And what it's doing is trying to get out all the toxins that are in between your neurons and flush them out and get rid of all the debris. And we know in diseases like dementias and Alzheimer's, we start to build up toxins between the neurons, and that makes them non-functional. So if you're not getting enough sleep, you're not going to do the CSF sweep to sweep the toxins out of the brain. Besides sleep, we want to reduce stress. What stress does is it inhibits learning and memory. And so our sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight, and makes us not remember. And that's actually good because if you're under a really stressful event, you're not wanting, the brain is like, you don't want to remember this later. But we want to activate our parasympathetic nervous system, which helps us relax. And we can all do that all the time, any time of the day, by taking deep, long breaths or centered breathing. That is activating the nerves that slow down your respiratory rate, which gets you into a relaxed state. So something we can do any time of the day. Also, we know that being positive or showing feelings of gratitude actually help neural networks that help reduce stress. So in the last year and a half, everybody's had a really difficult time. And it's great to acknowledge that. But even in your difficult time, if you can find one thing to be grateful for, it helps your neural network. Exercises you can do, yoga and Tai Chi are great for stress relievers as well. If we talk about regular exercise, it's a stress reliever as well, but it also increases blood flow to the brain, which brings more oxygen and more nutrients to our neurons. And so we want to do aerobic exercises like labeled here, the swimming, biking, hiking. And they say that 20 minutes a day, 5 times a week is good for good cardiovascular health. But a recent study of people over 60 showed that 40 minutes of brisk walking 3 days a week actually improved cognitive function. So getting your body in shape and keeping cognitive function, there's a little bit different in how much you should do. So the 40 minutes is about a 2-mile walk, about 3 days a week for improved cognitive function. Now, I'm not a nutritionist, but I'm going to talk really quick about brain food. The brain is covered in fat. So we do need good fats on our neurons to keep them healthy. And so we're looking for things that contain omega-3 fats. And I have a little picture of some of the foods you can eat that are high in omega-3s. Wild fish, that's also good for a protein source. Avocados, eggs, and nuts. We also want to think about veggies, and our green leafy veggies are good for antioxidants. One thing the brain doesn't like is processed sugar, and it's been linked to dementias and different neuronal diseases. So I like sugar, but try to pick things that are sweet, like berries are very low in sugar, but are also a very tasty treat. So try to substitute out that candy bar for some nice berries. And then I wanted to talk about water. And so our body is mostly water, and when we become dehydrated, our brain can't function properly. And so the rule of thumb is to drink half your body weight in ounces each day. And that's just of water. So if you consume coffee, tea, or whatever, it doesn't count towards this number. So if you're 150 pounds, you should be drinking about 75 ounces of water a day. The best way to keep track of it is to get yourself a water bottle and know how many of those you need to drink a day, just to keep up on your fluid intake. I wanted to talk about getting out in nature, and this is away from your electronic devices. And so this is called forest bathing. But there's studies that show that people that went on a 3-day backpacking trip actually had improved cognitive function when they returned, and an increased immune response. So better at fighting off disease and infection. And, you know, you can do this. You don't have to go to Yosemite. You can go to a park near your house, or if you have a backyard or a deck with a lot of plants and flowers on it, it's a great way to get out in nature and turn off all those electronics. I also want to remind you just about wearing helmets and seat belts. We want to protect our brain. If we have a traumatic brain injury, we obviously lose neurons, which will decrease our cognitive function. So just be very mindful of that. And I wanted to talk lastly about strengthening your brain and making new connections. And so every time we try something new, it challenges the brain to work and try to remember those things. And I usually tell students that you don't have to be the best soccer player or the best saxophone player. You just have to try it and experience new things. One of the best things I tell adults to do is to travel. Because every time you travel, you're going to a new place. You have to find a new restaurant. You have to figure out how to get to where you're going. And that doesn't mean, I know right now travel's hard, but I'm sure everybody has a town nearby that they've never been to that you could make a day trip to and go walk the downtown streets, go to their park, have lunch, and see something new. And that's very good for brain stimulation to keep your brain in shape and functioning. And so to test our memory, I've got a few interactive questions, and they're through an app called Poll Everywhere. So if you're wanting to participate, you can get out your phones and go to pollev.com. And once you get there, it's a free app. You would type in the B Puder, which is my name, and it'll take you to the few questions that we're going to do that are interactive. It might ask you to put in your name. I promise I made all the questions anonymous, so nobody will see what you actually answered in the poll. So if you're ready to play along, I will do the first question for you. And so these are just to test out your Poll Everywhere. So you're just going to, on your phone or whatever you're using, click on the face that represents how you're feeling right now. And then we'll see the responses show up live on the little poll. So we got some people that are like, yay, dark green, feeling very happy today. That is great. All right, testing our knowledge. So we're back to that brain picture. And we're going to try to find the frontal lobe. So you can click on wherever you think the frontal lobe is. It's the one that's on the front of the brain. It was the one that helps with movement of the body and controls our personalities. And it looks like we are all there. Perfect. Reinforcing what we learned. Temporal lobe, if you remember where that is, that's the thumb of the boxer's boxing glove. In here was our hippocampus, and those are the neurons that are important for helping us learn and remember dates and facts and information. And you guys are all on the thumb of the boxer's glove. Looks great. How about a true or false? Is it true that plasticity is the ability of our neurons to form new connections with other neurons? And it's doing that by creating dendritic spines. So is that something that we think is true? And if it's asking you to register, you can skip that so that you can respond to the question. We have everybody saying, yeah, that's true. That's what plasticity is. And you guys are spot on. Plasticity is the ability for our neurons to make new connections. All right, well, let's have a multiple choice question. And this has to do with what techniques can we learn to improve our learning retention? And I will let you read the 5 choices and choose which one you think is best. And then we'll look at the results here in a minute. We have some mixed here. And actually, A, B, C, and D are all good techniques to use, but E would be our best answer because E says all of the above are correct. So yes, we do want to draw and write out concepts. We want to say the concepts out loud, study 20 minutes a day, and recap with a friend. So the best choice here would be choice E, but if you choose any of the other ones, those are all good learning techniques. All right, this is a write-in. So you write in how many hours of sleep should adults get each night according to the study that just came out. And we'll start to see numbers pop up here. And we see that most people are saying it's that 7 to 8 hour window. Nobody's saying anything else. So we're all in agreement that that's a great number of hours to get, so you get in enough REM time so you can turn information into a memory. Another multiple choice, and it has to do about stress relievers and choosing which ones are great stress relievers here. And again, if you chose all of the above, that is true. Centered breathing, expressions of gratitude, and yoga are all great ways to relieve stress. So choice D is the best answer. Another true and false: exercise increases blood flow to the brain, which optimizes brain function. And that is true. So we want to get in that exercise so we can keep our neurons functioning well. Types of foods for brain health and function that we should be eating or being mindful of trying to eat each day. And if you chose D, omega-3s, green leafy vegetables, berries, those are all good foods, but the best answer here is D, because it says all of the above are good foods to eat for brain function. And then lastly, true or false, should we drink half our body weight in ounces of water each day? And that is absolutely true. I wanted to just show you some websites you could go to if you're interested in more neuroscience information. Society for Neuroscience, the Dana Foundation has a lot of information, as well as the American Association of Anatomists. And then finally, I wanted to thank everybody for letting me teach you a little bit about the brain and talking about brain function. This is my contact information. Happy to speak with you all. I think I'd like to stop share and see if there's anything in the chat that we can talk about.
Barb, thank you so much for such an awesome presentation, full of new information for folks and full of great reminders for folks as well. I just want to open it up for any questions that anyone may have, and for the awesome participants that you have all been. I want to throw in an audible and allow folks to unmute if you would like. So Alma and the chat, you can use the chat or you can unmute. Alma said, Barb, I missed your contact information. May you please post to the chat?
Sure.
All right, as Barb is posting her contact information, is there any other questions or thoughts that anyone may have? Like I said, feel free to unmute yourself or place it in the chat.
Yes, I've got a question for Barb. Hi, Barb. It's Alma here.
Alma.
Hi. When we are in that fight or flight, when we're anxious, what's happening to the neurons? So are they expanding? What is actually happening? What we're seeing? I know the green line, the red dots, but when we're in that scared, what's happening to them?
Yeah, so Dr. Sapolsky is at Stanford University, and he's written several books like for the public to read, and he describes the stress response very well. And his research has shown that in the hippocampus, the neural connections go away during stress. So the more stressed you are, the less connected neurons are. And we know if we're not connected, we're not going to be able to keep that information or retain as a memory. And this is actually done evolutionarily, so you don't remember a stressful event. But however, when we're constantly in stress day in and day out, that isn't very optimal for helping us learn and remember information. Before every exam, I have my students do a minute of deep breathing because everybody's stressed, and I want to get them out of their sympathetic nervous system and into parasympathetics. It also brings up a really interesting question of people that have experienced a trauma that's a criminal, and they're having to go to court and describe every event piece by piece. that might be very fuzzy to them because the brain is trying not to remember the trauma. And so I'm always interested in court cases when they keep drilling people. Well, what happened next? What happened next? The person probably and may not know all the specific details because the brain is set up to not remember stressful traumatic events.
I see. Well, I just wanted to add to that. Well, I know that while you said that that's happening, not to remember, but it seems that the stress is actually manifesting through places in your body parts. Like it's not happening in your head anymore. You're feeling it all over your body, the sensations. So
Right.
that's really interesting.
And it, you know, like when you feel tension in your neck, or some people, it goes to their digestive system. Remember that our brain is connected through nerves to every part of our body. So the stressors are coming originally from our nervous system and then impacting different organs or different muscles to have that same sort of stress kind of retained and kept in it. So I should have mentioned things like massage are really good to try to smooth out that stress that gets trapped or caught in a muscle.
Thank you. Thank you, Barb.
You're welcome.
All right, it looks like we have a question from 𝙎𝙤𝙀𝙬. 𝙎𝙤𝙀, if you would like to unmute and ask your question.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Puder. My question is, as you were talking about stress and the brain not liking sugar, what effect does this stuff called cortisol have on the brain?
Yeah, so cortisol is your stress hormone. So it is released, your neural networks release cortisol onto the brain, and that's having that effect on the neurons, especially our hippocampal neurons, not to make connections. So we do need cortisol to get through a stressful response. It helps the body do the fight or flight, but cortisol and hormones are interesting because hormones are constituents that travel through our bloodstream. And so they move slowly, whereas a neuron travels at 200 miles an hour. Hormones, once they get in the bloodstream, are going to float around until they're eliminated. So once a nerve turns on for cortisol to be released, it's floating through your blood supply until it can finally be eliminated. So the effect of we had a stressful response, release cortisol, but now cortisol hangs around for a while. So, and that's the problem with a hormonal release, that the effect can be a little bit long lasting. You're not in a stressful event, but you still have the circulating cortisol.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, 𝙎𝙀𝙀. We have a question from Tamandeep, and it is, how does it tie in with person going through anxiety and depression, and is it connected to the neurons as well?
Yeah, so I'm actually not a mental health expert. I should actually refer you to my son, who is a licensed psychologist, and you can actually find him on TikTok and Instagram. He's a modern therapist, and his name's Justin Puder. But I'll try to do my son's duty here about stress and anxiety. They are neural networks, but they stay perpetuated. I wish my son was here right now. They stay perpetuated with people that have ongoing anxiety and stress. And so there has to be different mechanisms to kind of shut down those neural circuits so people don't always feel anxious. And it's really interesting because we talk about the brain, and I'm a neuroscientist and know neural structures, but the mind is also a different component of the brain, but it's still neural networks that are controlling personality and moods and behaviors. And that gets into psychology and psychiatry. Not really in my field too much, but definitely something with neural networks that needs to be modulated so that people aren't constantly feeling that anxiety that they may feel.
All right, awesome. Are there any other questions or thoughts?
I just think it's really cool that you're a neuroscientist. You're like my very own Amy Farrah Fowler from Big Bang Theory. That's really awesome. I've never met a neuroscientist. This is cool.
There's so many of us because there's so much we don't know about the brain. So there's so much to study. about the brain, especially when the last question, when it gets into mental health and knowing those neural circuits, we're really starting to put that kind of information together about depression, anxiety, and tying it in with neural circuits. And that's, being studied, and we're getting all the way down to the cellular level of neurons and how they function as well. So there's so much still to learn about the brain that we don't know. So very interesting field for sure.
All right. So in the chat, also Tamandeep says thank you. Just wanted to relay that to you, Dr. Puder. Is there any other questions or thoughts from anyone?
It's algae again. I heard that traumas and the effects of traumas can be passed on from one generation to the next.
Yeah, so that we're talking about like a genetic transfer, and of course we inherited our parents' genes, and in that genome might be something that is going to be expressed that relays that trauma that's come down through your genetic line. So that is very true. Sometimes it's interesting when people have, when they're afraid of a spider, yet they never really had any sort of they never were bit by a spider or something like that, right? So it's probably been passed down through the genetic line, from their family, something about, spiders. But definitely trauma can be, passed down through our genes. And we're just starting to study that as well to understand that kind of genetic. And then we also talk about epigenetic, which we alter our genes because of what's happened to us and how that starts to affect our health and well-being because of traumas that we've experienced that can alter our own genome, not passed down from our family.
And with that, and I hope this isn't too taboo, but how does that affect, as far as racism, dealing with the issues of racism and the passed on legacy of that trauma?
And I think that different groups that have experienced, different sorts of traumas are going to probably have more stress, more anxiety, more depression because of that, what's happened to them as a group, maybe not to them directly, but to their communities and people in their communities or to their families. So it sets people up from a health perspective. If you're more stressed, it's going to start to take its effect on your nervous system and other organs of the body. So, there might be some health concerns just because as a certain ethnic group, you have experienced more trauma, and that's going to be very hard on the body. So very important to, do things that you can to eliminate or restore.
All right, great questions and thoughts from all of our awesome participants. Is there any other questions or thoughts? All right, well, hearing none, I just want to thank everyone again for joining us for this awesome presentation. Really want to thank Dr. Puder for this amazing presentation that she just put on. I want to remind everyone that the session is being recorded. You can view the recording or share the recording with friends, family, colleagues, the people that you serve. And you can access the recordings on the Sacramento Promise Zone Facebook page. You can also access the recording on the Sacramento Promise Zone YouTube channel. And also encourage everyone to check out that Sacramento Promise Zone Facebook page to get access to free resources and low-cost resources across all kinds of sectors, health stuff, education stuff, job opportunities, housing, all kinds of stuff. And then also want to notify folks that there are going to be future sessions in this awesome Mind, Body, and Spirit Health Series. The next session will take place in November. It's going to actually be, I don't want to get the date wrong. Let me take a quick glance at the calendar. November 12th. November 12th, I believe it is. But double check. You can check out the Sacramento Promise Zone Facebook page. You can check out www.sacramentopromisezone.org as well. And you can find out more about our future sessions. So thank you all for being here with us today. And we look forward to seeing you in future sessions.